The girl who stood alone. The afternoon sun filtered weakly through the tall, narrow windows of Courtroom 3C, its light casting faint golden bars across the polished wooden floor. Judge Alan Whittaker sat behind his imposing oak bench, his fingers laced together, resting heavily on the thick case file before him. His reading glasses perched low on his nose, reflecting the faint light. From the outside, he was the embodiment of authority. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, with sharp features and salt and pepper hair that gave him the air of someone both respected and feared. But inside, Alan Whittaker was tired. The years of presiding over family court cases had weighed on him like a slow-building pressure, compressing his spirit until there was little left but procedure and protocol. Every day brought new tragedies disguised as legal disputes, custody battles that turned children into bargaining chips, foster placements that felt more like sentencing than salvation, and promises of safety that too often ended in broken trust. He glanced at the clock above the door. 4:52 p.m., almost done for the day. Almost. If there are no further matters, this court. A voice, soft but unwavering, cut through the silence. Your Honor, I want you to adopt me. The gavel froze in midair. The room, nearly empty save for a tired social worker, a disinterested court reporter, and a lone child standing at the defendant's table, went silent. The girl stood no taller than his desk, her shoes scuffed, her sweater one size too large, the sleeves swallowing her thin wrists. Her face was framed by wild curls that hadn't seen a brush in days, and her eyes, enormous, dark, and filled with something beyond fear, locked with his. Alan felt the breath catch in his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice betraying more surprise than authority. The girl stood her ground, her chin quivering but held high. "I want you to adopt me," she repeated. "You're the judge. You make the rules." There was a ripple, not of laughter, but of disbelief. From the clerk's desk, the social worker, a thin woman named Mrs. Garvey, who Alan had seen too often in this room, took a slow step forward. "Sarah," she said softly. "Sweetheart, that's not how it works." The girl, Sarah, didn't take her eyes off the judge. It could work if he made it. Alan's throat felt tight. There was something in her voice, not the plea of a child who wanted something frivolous like a treat or a toy, but the voice of a child who had nothing left to lose. "Sarah," Alan said, and the weight of his robe felt heavier with each word. "Judges can't adopt children from their own courtrooms. It's a conflict of interest." She took a step closer to the bench, her hands balled into fists at her sides. "That's just a rule. And you said judges are supposed to make sure rules are fair. This one isn't fair." Alan exhaled, forcing himself to break eye contact. There were rules that made sense in abstract legal theory, but often made no sense at all in a courtroom where real lives were at stake. Mrs. Garvey stepped in, her voice kind but firm. "Come on, Sarah. Let's go, honey. The Greenfields are waiting for you." The name triggered a visible shudder in the girl. Her fists clenched tighter, her whole body stiffening. "No," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "I don't want to go with them." Alan's brow furrowed. "The Greenfields?" he asked, more to himself than anyone. He vaguely recalled the name from prior case files. Longtime foster parents with a spotless record on paper. "Wonderful couple," Mrs. Garvey said quickly, her smile brittle. They'd fostered over 15 children. Sarah's shoulders hunched forward, her voice smaller now. "They don't like kids." Alan's hand hovered over his gavel, his fingers curling into a loose fist. "Is there a specific reason you don't want to go with them, Sarah?" The girl's eyes darted toward Mrs. Garvey, fear flickering in the dark depths. "They make us stay in the basement," she said softly. "They put a lock on the door and say it's because they need quiet upstairs." Alan's stomach turned. He'd heard versions of this story before. Too many times. He'd seen the official reports, glowing home studies, glowing interviews, But the children's stories rarely made it onto paper. The social worker's smile tightened. That's not accurate, Judge Whittaker. They sometimes have a quiet time rule. They're very structured. Sarah's voice rose. They don't let us eat until after they're done. And if you spill anything, you have to sleep in the garage. Mrs. Garvey paled, but her expression remained composed. Sarah has a very active imagination. Alan could see it, the gap between policy and reality. And the tightening knot in his gut told him which version to believe. Sarah, Alan said gently, where have you been staying these past few days? She shifted her weight, her arms crossing protectively. Nowhere, she said. Sometimes at the shelter. Sometimes at that other house. Which other house? Her jaw trembled. The one with the yelling. Alan leaned forward. Have you ever had a home that felt safe, Sarah? Her eyes glistened, and for the first time, her guard cracked. No. The air in the room thickened. Alan Whittaker wasn't an impulsive man. His career had been built on patience, caution, and the careful balance of compassion and law. But something inside him, a small crack in the dam, widened until it was impossible to ignore. He could see his own daughter in her, not the physical resemblance, but the same fragile hope that had lived in his own home years before cancer took her away at 10 years old. Miss Garvey, Alan said, his voice steady now. You said the Greenfields are expecting her tonight. The social worker nodded quickly. Yes, Your Honor. They've already made up her room. Alan tapped his fingers once against the bench. I'd like to review the Greenfield file in my chambers. That's unnecessary, Judge. The placement's already approved. It's not a request, Alan said, his voice turning hard. It's an order. The social worker's protest died on her lips. Of course, Your Honor. She turned to gather her files, but Sarah's eyes were locked on him again. Are you going to send me there? He didn't answer right away. Judges weren't saviors. They were referees. But something about the way Sarah stood, her shoulders tense, her breath held as though waiting for another disappointment, made him hesitate. I'm going to look into it, he said at last. And until I do, you're not going anywhere tonight. Her breath released in a shudder, and her hand slowly unclenched. Where am I going? The words tumbled out before he could stop them. With me. A shocked silence followed, even Sarah's wide eyes growing larger. Mrs. Garvey stepped forward. Judge Whittaker, you can't. I'm not adopting her, he clarified. I'm placing her under emergency protective custody, under my supervision, until I review the Greenfield file and find an appropriate placement. Sarah's lips twitched into the faintest glimmer of a smile. Alan knew this was a dangerous step, one that could put his career at risk if handled improperly. But as Sarah stepped cautiously closer to him, as though unsure if safety was real, he knew some risks were worth taking. Come on, kid, he said softly. Let's go home. The courtroom door closed behind them, leaving silence in their wake. The weight of two worlds. The heavy oak door to Judge Alan Whittaker's house creaked softly as it swung open. Sarah stood at the threshold, her small hands clutching the straps of her worn backpack so tightly her knuckles turned pale. The house smelled like wood polish and old books, and the air inside was cool and still, as if the house itself wasn't quite sure what to make of its newest occupant. Alan stood just behind her, holding the door open with one hand, his briefcase and a manila folder tucked under the other arm. Come in, he said, the words sounding awkward in his own ears. He'd lived alone for more than a decade. Inviting someone in, especially a child, felt like an alien act. Sarah stepped inside, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floor. She didn't wander, didn't touch, didn't even take off her backpack. She stood just inside the door, as though expecting to be told she'd made a mistake. Alan cleared his throat. You can put your bag down if you want. She did, but only after a long hesitation, placing it carefully at her feet as if afraid it might disappear if she let go. Alan set his briefcase on the hallway table and exhaled slowly, wondering when the quiet of his house had started to feel so oppressive. "I'll show you where you can sleep," he said, motioning for her to follow him. Her footsteps were nearly silent as she trailed behind, sticking close to the wall as if trying to make herself invisible. Upstairs, Alan opened the door to the guest room. It was a plain room, just a twin bed, a dresser, and a desk under the window. It had been years since anyone had stayed there. It was clean, but impersonal. There were no toys, no colors, nothing that belonged to a child. Sarah stood in the doorway, her dark eyes scanning the space. "Is this where I stay?" "For now," Alan said, suddenly uncomfortable with how sterile it looked through her eyes. "You can. We can get you some things, if you want." She nodded, but it was the automatic nod of a child who had learned to say yes even when she felt nothing. "Bathroom's down the hall," Alan said, "and my room's just at the end if you need anything." The words felt awkward, and Sarah didn't reply. She just stood there, still as a statue, her small body half shielded behind the doorframe. "I'll get you some pajamas," Alan added. "I have some," she whispered, bending to unzip her backpack. Inside were a few mismatched clothes, most too small, and a worn stuffed lion whose mane had been hugged nearly bare. Alan stood there, at a loss for what to say. "Okay, I'll let you get settled." He retreated to his own room, closing the door with a soft click. Leaning back against it, he closed his eyes. What was he thinking? Bringing a child here? His house wasn't a home, not anymore. It was a place to sleep between hearings, a place where silence had become companion and shield. And yet there she was, down the hall, a child who had already been failed by every adult before him. His phone buzzed. It was Martin, his old friend and fellow judge, who'd heard through the courthouse grapevine about Alan's spontaneous decision. "Alan," Martin's voice was low and incredulous, "you're bringing a ward of the state into your house. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I'm tired of pretending the system works," Alan replied. "The Greenfields, something's wrong there. Even if you're right, you can't just collect strays." "She's not a stray." Alan's voice was sharper than he intended. "She's a kid." There was a pause. "You remember what happened last time?" Martin said softly. "You can't save them all." Alan didn't respond. He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the bed, running both hands through his hair. Of course he remembered. There wasn't a day that passed without remembering. Later, Alan knocked lightly on Sarah's door. There was no answer, so he pushed it open gently. She was sitting on the bed, her knees drawn up to her chest, the stuffed lion clutched in her arms. She'd changed into pajama pants that were too short, leaving her thin ankles exposed, and a t-shirt with a faded cartoon on the front. "Are you hungry?" Alan asked, keeping his voice as soft as possible. She shook her head. "You sure? I was going to order pizza." Her head lifted slightly. "What kind?" "Whatever kind you want." The sheer disbelief on her face nearly broke him. "Cheese," she whispered. "Just cheese." "Okay, cheese it is." The pizza box sat open on the coffee table in the living room. Sarah perched on the very edge of the couch, taking small bites of her slice, chewing slowly as though she was afraid someone might take it away if she finished too fast. Alan sat at the other end, a plate balanced on his knee, watching her out of the corner of his eye. "Do you like cartoons?" he asked. She shrugged. "How about a movie?" Another shrug. Alan scrolled through the streaming service until he found something animated and lighthearted. Bright colors filled the screen, but Sarah kept her gaze on her plate, the crust of her pizza going untouched. "Sarah," Alan said gently, "it's okay here." She didn't respond. He didn't push. The first night was the hardest. Alan heard her footsteps around midnight, soft shuffles in the hallway outside his room. He waited, listening as she hovered near his door, then retreated back down the hall. At 2:17 a.m., there was a knock. Alan was already awake. "Come in." The door creaked open, and Sarah stood there, the stuffed lion clutched tight, her bare feet pale against the hardwood floor. She hesitated. I don't like it in there. Alan sat up, his heart aching at the quiet confession. Do you want to sit in here for a while? She nodded and crossed the room slowly, stopping beside the bed like she wasn't sure if it was real. Alan patted the mattress beside him. She climbed up, sitting stiffly on top of the covers, her back against the headboard. For a while, they sat in silence. It's too quiet, she said finally. Alan swallowed hard. It's been quiet here for a long time. She turned her head slightly. Did you have kids? A daughter, Alan said softly. A long time ago. What happened to her? She got sick. Sarah didn't ask anything else. She just hugged her lion tighter. Alan turned on the small lamp beside his bed, casting a warm glow over the room. Do you want me to leave the light on? Sarah nodded. He lay back down, not expecting to sleep, but after a while, her breathing evened out beside him. She hadn't laid down, just sat curled at the top of the bed, her back resting against the headboard. But her eyes drifted shut, and for the first time, in who knew how long, she felt safe enough to sleep. Alan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Judges weren't supposed to cross lines. They were supposed to observe from the safety of the bench, rendering verdicts without entanglement. But in all his years, Alan had never been able to build a wall thick enough to block out the faces of the children who passed through his courtroom. And now, one of them was here. He didn't know if he could save her. But for the first time in years, he was willing to try. The sun was just starting to rise when Alan woke to find Sarah still beside him, her lion tucked under her chin, her tiny feet curled beneath her knees. The house was no longer silent. The soft sound of her breathing filled the room. Fragile, but real. It was the sound of something worth protecting. And Alan knew, no matter what rules he had to break, no matter how high the cost, he would protect her. Cracks in the walls. The warm scent of eggs and toast drifted up the staircase, curling beneath the crack of the guest room door. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, disoriented at first, her small body tensed and ready to spring. The unfamiliar softness of the mattress beneath her slowed her reflexes, and for a moment, she froze. This wasn't a group home. This wasn't a locked basement. The memory of the night before came back in a rush. The judge's house, the quiet room, the soft light that he left on without being asked. Sarah shifted slightly, and her hand found Lionel, her worn stuffed lion. She pulled him close and listened. Downstairs, the faint clatter of dishes told her the judge. Alan, she reminded herself, was awake. The air was different in this house. The silence didn't hum with threat the way it had in other homes. There was no creak of boots warning her to hide, no sudden slamming of doors. It was a different kind of quiet, one that felt fragile, like it could disappear at any moment. Sarah swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet brushing the hardwood. Her backpack sat near the door, untouched since last night. Every instinct told her to keep it close, to be ready to run if the judge changed his mind. But something so small she almost didn't recognize it, held her still. Hope. In the kitchen, Alan stood at the stove, spatula in hand, staring down at the eggs like they were a legal puzzle he couldn't quite solve. How much salt was too much? How runny was runny? He was out of practice. Cooking for one was easy. Toast, coffee, maybe something frozen on weekends. Cooking for a child. That was new terrain. He heard her footsteps before he saw her. Light, hesitant. She hovered in the doorway, her fingers twisting the hem of her oversized t-shirt. Alan turned slowly, careful not to startle her. "Morning," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I made breakfast." Sarah's gaze darted to the table. A plate already set with scrambled eggs, toast, and a neat glass of orange juice. She didn't move. "You can sit wherever you want," Alan added, realizing the unspoken rules she was used to. Only sitting when invited, only eating when told. She slid into a chair at the very edge of the table, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The food sat untouched. Alan took the chair across from her, his own plate far simpler, just toast and coffee. He took a deliberate bite, showing her it was safe, normal. "It's okay to eat," he said gently. Sarah picked up a piece of toast, breaking off a corner so small it barely counted. She ate it silently, her eyes flickering toward him after every bite, as though waiting for him to take the food away. They ate like that for several minutes. Alan trying to act like this was any ordinary breakfast, Sarah treating every bite like it might be her last. "You sleep okay?" Alan asked. She gave a non-committal shrug. "That's okay," Alan said, taking the sip of coffee. "Takes time to get used to a new place." He didn't ask more, didn't press her to talk about what had happened before. Every child he'd seen in his courtroom had the same thin, stretched look, the look of someone who'd spent too long waiting for the ground to give out beneath them. Alan wasn't going to be the one to make her fall again. By noon, Sarah had drifted back to the guest room. Alan gave her space, but his mind never left her for long. He was supposed to be reviewing files, a backlog of custody disputes, emergency placements, and parental rights hearings. But every time he opened a folder, his thoughts slid sideways, back to the small girl in the too big t-shirt sitting at his kitchen table, nibbling toast like a sparrow. His phone rang, snapping him back to the present. It was Martin. "Alan," Martin's voice was low. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest." Alan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "What now?" "The Greenfields. They called the placement board. They're filing a complaint. Said you kidnapped Sarah." Alan's jaw clenched. "I placed her in emergency protective custody under my authority. It's legal." "Legal, but not common. And not quiet." Martin's voice softened. "They're going to fight you, Alan. They want her back." A cold weight settled in Alan's chest. He hadn't anticipated the Greenfields would make trouble so fast. Most foster families, even the bad ones, preferred to cut their losses and move on to the next check. But the Greenfields were different. They wanted Sarah back, and Alan didn't like what that meant. "She's not going back there," Alan said flatly. "I know you believe that," Martin replied, "but you might not have a choice." The afternoon sunlight turned Sarah's window into a square of gold. She sat on the floor, her knees tucked under her chin, Lionel balanced carefully in her lap. The house was quiet again, but not like the quiet of the basement or the shelter. This was a waiting quiet, the kind that came before something happened. She could hear Alan talking downstairs, his voice low and steady, but the words were blurred by distance. Adults always talked about kids when they thought they couldn't hear. Plans made over phones, decisions made in hushed tones. Sarah had learned to listen between the silences. When Alan's voice stopped, she braced herself. The knock came moments later. "Can I come in?" Alan's voice was careful, like someone approaching a stray dog. Sarah gave a small nod. Alan stepped inside, sitting down on the edge of the bed so he wasn't towering over her. "I wanted to talk to you about something." Sarah's grip on Lionel tightened. "You're sending me back?" "No," Alan said immediately, the firmness in his voice surprising even himself. "But the Greenfields, they'd want you back. They're going to say I didn't follow the rules." Sarah's breath hitched, her fingers twisting Lionel's already worn mane. "Please," she whispered. "I'll be good. I won't touch anything. I'll stay out of the way." Alan's heart cracked in two. "You don't have to be good to stay, Sarah," he said softly. "You're not here because you earned it. You're here because you deserve to be safe." She didn't seem to know what to do with that. The rules she knew were clear: behave or be punished, stay invisible or be sent away. There was no category for someone keeping her simply because she was worth keeping. "They locked me in the basement," Sarah said suddenly, her voice barely audible. "They said I made too much noise. I wasn't even talking. Alan's hands curled into fists. That's not going to happen here. Sarah lifted her gaze to his for the first time. You can't promise that. Alan exhaled slowly. I know it's hard to believe, but I promise, Sarah, you're safe here. The words hovered between them, too fragile to trust. For now. That night, Sarah's door was cracked open, just enough for Alan to see the glow of her nightlight. He stood in his own doorway, watching the faint light spill across the hall. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was a start. Downstairs, Alan sat at the kitchen table, papers spread before him. The Greenfield file lay open, photos of their immaculate house, smiling for inspectors, perfectly staged for caseworkers. He knew how easily abuse hid behind manicured lawns and polite smiles. He'd seen it too many times. His phone buzzed with a new message from Martin. Greenfield's filed for emergency hearing. 48 hours. Be ready. Alan's stomach twisted, but his eyes drifted back to the hallway where Sarah slept. For years, he'd followed every rule, upheld every policy. It hadn't saved the children who needed saving. Maybe it was time for a different approach. He wouldn't let her go back, no matter the cost. Storm before the truth. The rain began just after midnight, soft at first, barely more than mist tapping against the windows of Alan Whittaker's house. By the time the clock struck 2:00 a.m., it had gathered strength, a heavy downpour washing over the quiet suburban street, blurring the streetlights into smeared halos of gold. Alan sat in the living room, his reading glasses slipping down his nose, the glow of his laptop screen the only light. He'd combed through the Greenfield file 3 times already, searching for something, anything, that could break the illusion of their perfect home. Their records were too clean. That was the problem. Real foster homes had mess, complaints over curfews or missed appointments, minor infractions from overwhelmed parents juggling too much. But the Greenfield's file, sterile, polished, too perfect. It was the silence between the lines that scared him the most. Upstairs, the floor creaked softly. Alan's gaze flicked to the ceiling, where Sarah's room lay directly above. He'd expected her to struggle to sleep, but the house had stayed quiet until now. Then the footsteps came again, soft and tentative. Alan set his laptop aside and rose, his joints groaning from too much sitting. The door to Sarah's room stood slightly ajar, just as she left it. Through the narrow gap, Alan saw her curled at the foot of the bed, her knees drawn tight to her chest. Lionel's worn body clutched under her chin. Sarah, Alan whispered, keeping his voice low so it didn't shatter the fragile stillness. She flinched, her head snapping up. Even in the dim light, Alan saw her wide eyes glisten. She didn't speak, but her breath came in sharp little bursts. Bad dream. Alan stepped just inside the room. Sarah shook her head, but her thin shoulders trembled. I wasn't asleep. He sank slowly onto the floor, careful to keep distance between them. You okay? Sarah hugged Lionel tighter, her fingers digging into the threadbare fur. The rain. It sounds like. She stopped, her teeth sinking into her lower lip until it turned white. Sounds like what? Alan prompted gently. Her voice, when it came, was so soft it nearly vanished beneath the rain. The pipes. In the basement. The basement. Alan's jaw tightened, but his face stayed calm. The Greenfield's basement. Sarah nodded, her curls bouncing slightly. When it rained, the pipes would creak. I could hear the water rushing through the walls. It sounded like footsteps, like someone was coming. Alan exhaled slowly. No basements here, he said. Just wood floors and bad plumbing upstairs. A flicker of something, maybe a smile, crossed Sarah's face. Your toilet makes a weird noise. Helen chuckled. Yeah, it does. The laughter faded, and silence stretched between them again, heavier this time. Alan could see it, the question she wanted to ask, the fear stopping her. Are you worried about the hearing tomorrow? he asked softly. Sarah's gaze dropped to Lionel. She nodded. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you don't go back, Alan said. But I need you to help me. Her head lifted slightly, confusion flickering in her eyes. Me? Alan leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. Tomorrow, the Greenfields are going to tell the judge you made up stories because you didn't like rules. They'll say they're good people who were just trying to help. Sarah's fingers twisted Lionel's ear over and over again, her body curling tighter. I know it's scary, Alan continued, but you're the only one who knows the truth. She was shaking her head before he even finished. They'll call me a liar. They always do. No one listens. I'll listen, Alan said. And so will the judge. But you have to be brave enough to tell the truth. Sarah's breath hitched and her voice came out hoarse. What if they take me anyway? Alan swallowed the knot forming in his throat. Then we fight again. Tears filled her eyes, but they didn't fall. What if you get tired of fighting? I won't. Sarah stared at him, searching for cracks in his promise. Alan didn't flinch. Whatever it took, however many hearings, however many sleepless nights, he would fight for her. For the first time, Sarah let out a shaky breath and whispered, Okay. The morning arrived gray and cold, the rain tapering to a mist that clung to the grass and pavement. Alan stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching Sarah descend one careful step at a time. She wore the navy dress they'd picked out together, her curls combed, and gathered into a lopsided ponytail that Alan had wrestled into place with more determination than success. She looked small, too small to stand in front of a courtroom and face the people who had hurt her. You ready? Alan asked. Sarah didn't answer, but she took his offered hand, her fingers cold and trembling in his. The courtroom was smaller than Alan's usual chambers, more intimate, but no less intimidating. The Greenfields were already there when they arrived, seated at the long polished table, their lawyer whispering urgently to them. Shyla Greenfield was perfectly composed, her blonde hair in a smooth twist, her expression serene. Randall, heavier and broader, sat with his arms crossed, his mouth set in a hard line. They didn't look at Sarah. They didn't even acknowledge her. Sarah's grip on Alan's hand tightened until her nails dug into his skin. The presiding judge, Mary Ann Vickers, entered, her expression unreadable. Alan knew her well. A cautious but fair judge, not easily swayed by theatrics. That was both good and bad. All rise, the bailiff called. Alan stood with Sarah beside him, her small body almost hidden by his presence. Judge Vickers' gaze softened slightly when she saw Sarah, but her voice remained firm. This is an emergency custody hearing regarding placement of Sarah Bennett. She flipped through her file. Judge Whittaker, you initiated this emergency removal. Yes, Your Honor, Alan said, his voice calm but carrying. She gestured for him to begin. Alan walked her through everything, the history, the multiple placements, Sarah's allegations, and the sterile perfection of the Greenfields files. On paper, they seem ideal, he admitted, but the gaps are too convenient, the records too clean. Sheila's lawyer stood next. Objection, Your Honor. None of this is evidence. It's speculation. Then let's hear evidence, Judge Vickers said, turning her attention to Sarah. Miss Bennett, would you be willing to speak to the court? Sarah's fingers dug into Lionel's paw, her throat working. Alan crouched beside her. Remember, he whispered, the truth. Slowly, painfully, Sarah stood. Her knees wobbled, but she held herself upright. They locked me in the basement, she said softly. For hours, sometimes all night. Sheila's lawyer stood. She has a history of exaggeration. She's run away from multiple homes. I wasn't lying, Sarah said, louder now, her voice trembling but strong. They said I was too loud. They made me eat in the basement after they were done. They took my books and toys because they said I didn't deserve them. Her breath hitched, but she forced the words out. They said nobody would ever want me. Sheila's smile flickered, and for just a second, something darker slipped through her mask. Cold contempt. Alan stood beside Sarah, his presence solid and protective. She's telling the truth. Sarah's lip trembled. Please don't send me back. The silence in the room was heavy. Judge Vickers folded her hands, her expression unreadable. I'll review the evidence and make my ruling within 24 hours. As they left the courtroom, Sarah's hand found Alan's. Did I do okay? She whispered. Alan knelt beside her, ignoring the stares from the Greenfields and their lawyer. You were brave. Did it matter? It always matters. She nodded, but her eyes stayed worried. Alan squeezed her hand, silently vowing to carry the weight of her fear for as long as it took. Together, they walked out into the mist, into a future that was still uncertain, but no longer hopeless, a fragile flame. The drive home from the courthouse was silent, except for the gentle hum of the engine and the faint, rhythmic patter of drizzle on the windshield. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, Lionel pressed tightly against her chest. Her wide eyes never left the window, though Alan doubted she was seeing anything outside. He wanted to say something reassuring, something light to break the oppressive quiet, but every sentence he rehearsed in his head felt wrong. What comfort could he offer when the next 24 hours could tear her world apart again? At a stoplight, Alan glanced sideways at her. She was so still, her small fingers gripping Lionel's mane the way someone might cling to a life raft in a storm. They don't get to hurt you again, Alan said softly, breaking the silence. No matter what happens, we're not going to let them. Sarah's shoulders twitched, like she wanted to believe him but didn't dare. Do judges ever lie? She asked suddenly. The question cut through the air like a blade. Alan swallowed. Some do, but not me. Not to you. She turned slightly, her face half hidden by Lionel's worn body. That's what they said too, she whispered. Alan's hands tightened around the steering wheel. Back at the house, Sarah stood in the hallway, unsure of where to go. Alan had left the television on, soft voices drifting from the living room, but Sarah made no move toward it. Instead, she hovered near the staircase, her backpack still slung over her shoulder like a shield. You can go upstairs if you want, Alan said, setting his keys on the entry table. Or we can pick a movie. Whatever you feel like. Sarah shifted her weight from foot to foot. Can I stay close? Alan's heart clenched at the question's quiet vulnerability. Of course. He gestured toward the couch, and after a beat, Sarah walked stiffly into the living room and perched on the farthest cushion. Alan sat at the other end, leaving a safe space between them. Neither reached for the remote. It was Sarah who broke the silence. What happens if they win? Alan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Then they take you back. Her grip on Lionel tightened. But that's not the end, Alan said firmly. If they win, we appeal. We investigate. We fight. This isn't over. Sarah's small voice floated between them. What if they don't stop? Alan's throat tightened. They will. How do you know? Because I'm not going anywhere, Alan said, and for once, he didn't have to force the certainty into his voice. They don't get to decide what happens to you anymore. The words should have felt comforting, but Sarah only curled further into herself, her body folding inward like a flower closing against the cold. That evening, Alan made grilled cheese, the only thing he knew Sarah would reliably eat. She sat at the kitchen table, feet dangling above the floor, methodically peeling apart the sandwich into thin layers before taking small bites of the cheese. Alan washed dishes with his back to her, giving her space, but keeping her within sight. He'd spent decades studying human behavior in his courtroom, but none of it prepared him for Sarah's quiet fear. It was woven into her very bones, the way she moved, the way she held her breath at unexpected sounds, the way she never asked for anything. Can I ask you something? Alan said, drying his hands. Sarah nodded, not looking up from her plate. When you lived with the Greenfields, did anyone ever visit? Inspectors? Social workers? Sarah's chewing slowed. Sometimes. What happened when they came? They cleaned everything, Sarah said. We had to stay upstairs and smile. Alan's fingers gripped the dish towel. Did they ever ask you questions? Sarah nodded again. But they were always in the room. Who was? Mrs. Greenfield, Sarah said. She held my hand. Alan's stomach twisted. Did you ever try to tell anyone? Sarah's shoulders lifted in a shrug so small it was almost invisible. It didn't matter. Alan knelt beside her chair, careful not to move too close. It matters now. Her eyes flickered toward him, but she said nothing. That night, Alan couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah, huddled in the courtroom, her voice trembling but brave. She put everything on the line, trusted him with her truth, and the system might still fail her. He found himself in his study, old case files spread across the desk. Not Sarah's, but dozens like hers. Cases where foster families had been reported and ignored. Complaints dismissed as exaggerations. Children silenced by the machinery of bureaucracy. Somewhere in those files was the reason Alan had stopped fighting years ago. Too many losses. Too many children swallowed by the system. But now, Sarah was asleep upstairs, and the cost of giving up was something he couldn't bear. A soft creak pulled him from his thoughts. Sarah stood in the doorway, Lionel dragging at her side, her bare feet pale against the dark wood floor. Can't sleep? Alan asked, his voice soft in the quiet. She shook her head. Come sit, he said, pulling out the chair beside him. She approached slowly, the same caution she always carried, and climbed into the oversized chair. Her eyes darted across the papers. Are those kids like me? She asked. Alan hesitated. Some, yeah. What happened to them? The truth stuck in his throat. Some of them found safe homes. Others didn't. We're still trying to help them, Alan said carefully. Did someone fight for them? Alan's hands curled into fists beneath the desk. Not always. Sarah traced her finger along the edge of one folder, the paper soft and worn from too many hands. I didn't think anyone would ever fight for me. Alan turned, kneeling beside her chair so they were eye level. I'm fighting for you. Even if you lose. Even if I lose. Sarah's fingers twisted Lionel's ear, her gaze darting away. I'm scared. Alan didn't reach for her, didn't crowd her space, but he let the truth settle between them. Me too. For the first time, her lips curved into something faintly like a smile. The next morning, Alan found Sarah sitting on the front porch, Lionel in her lap, her knees pulled to her chest. The air was crisp, the sky still gray from the storm, but she didn't seem to mind the chill. Breakfast, Alan offered, leaning against the doorframe. She shook her head. Alan stepped out, hands in his pockets. Mind some company. Sarah shrugged, but didn't protest as Alan lowered himself onto the step beside her. They sat in silence, the quiet broken only by the rustling of leaves and the faint hum of distant traffic. Do you like it here? Alan asked. Sarah's fingers rubbed Lionel's mane. It's quiet. Too quiet. She shook her head. The good kind. Alan's throat tightened. I'm glad. They sat like that until the phone rang inside. The call they'd been waiting for. Alan stood, his hands suddenly clammy. Want to come inside with me? Sarah shook her head. I'll come get you after, Alan promised. She gave him a small nod, and Alan stepped inside to face whatever awaited them. In his office, Alan pressed the phone to his ear, heart thudding as Judge Vickers' calm voice filled the line. I've reviewed the evidence, she said, and I'm ready to issue my ruling. Alan held his breath. The Greenfields foster license is officially suspended pending full investigation. Sarah will remain in your custody until a permanent placement can be determined. Alan's knees nearly buckled with relief. Thank you, he managed. Don't thank me yet, Judge Vickers said. The Greenfields are already filing an appeal. This fight isn't over. Alan's hand tightened around the phone. It will be. He stepped outside, where Sarah was still sitting, her small form framed by the soft morning light. She looked up at him, her face a careful mask. Alan didn't make her wait. You're staying. Her breath caught. For real. For real. Sarah's face broke open into the first real smile Alan had seen, tentative, but shining through the cracks. She didn't run to him. She didn't hug him. But she whispered, "Thank you." And for Alan Whittaker, those two words were the only verdict that mattered. The fight for forever. The light rain had stopped by the time Sarah came back inside, but the damp chill seemed to cling to her small frame. Alan watched her from the kitchen, noticing how she wiped her sneakers carefully on the mat. Not because they were muddy, but because she had learned somewhere, long ago, that leaving even the faintest trace of herself was dangerous. He had seen it before, in too many children who passed through his courtroom. Children trained to vanish inside themselves, to make their presence so small it might be overlooked. Children who didn't believe they deserved space. Not in his house. Not anymore. "Want to help me make pancakes?" Alan asked, flipping through the worn pages of an old cookbook. Sarah's brows knitted together. "I don't know how." "Neither do I," Alan admitted with a conspiratorial whisper. "We'll learn together." Her lips twitched at the edges. Not a smile exactly, but something close. She shuffled into the kitchen, Lionel still clutched under one arm, and stood next to him at the counter. Alan handed her the measuring cup, letting her pour flour into the bowl. Her hands were too small to hold it steady, so his larger ones cupped hers, guiding them. For once, she didn't flinch at his touch. "Okay," Alan said, after a flour spill and a lot of trial and error. "These might not be the prettiest pancakes, but they'll definitely be pancakes." Sarah's giggle surprised both of them. Small and soft, like a bird's first song. The next day brought reality crashing back through the front door in the form of a manila envelope hand-delivered by a grim-faced court officer. The Greenfields attorney had filed an emergency appeal, demanding Sarah's immediate return and an investigation into Alan for alleged judicial misconduct, accusing him of using his position to manipulate the system for personal gain. Alan read the notice 3 times, his knuckles whitening at the edges of the paper. He had expected retaliation, but not this fast. "Is it bad?" Sarah's small voice came from the hallway, where she stood partially hidden behind the banister. Alan set the envelope down carefully. "It's not over," he said honestly. "But that doesn't mean we stop." "Are they coming for me?" she whispered. The fear in her voice twisted something deep inside him. "Not today," Alan said. "And not if I can help it." Sarah didn't come all the way into the room. Instead, she stood silently at the edge of the hall, watching him. It was the same careful observation he'd seen in court, the way a child learned to read the smallest shifts in adult moods, looking for signs of danger before they struck. "Do you want to help me pick out some books for your room?" Ellen asked, changing the subject. She hesitated, then nodded. At the bookstore, Sarah walked a step behind Ellen, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Lionel left behind for the first time. Each time Ellen glanced at her, she was staring at the shelves like they were something forbidden, a world that didn't belong to her. "You can pick anything," Ellen said gently. "It's your room now." She stood in front of the adventure books, running her fingers along the spines, but never pulling one out. "What if I leave?" Ellen's throat tightened. "You're not leaving." "But what if they make me?" Ellen knelt beside her. "Then the books come with us." Sarah's fingers brushed a single book, The Secret Garden, before pulling back quickly, like she'd done something wrong. "Want that one?" Ellen asked. She nodded, and this time, her fingers held on. The emergency appeal hearing was set for Friday, too soon for Ellen to feel ready, too far away for Sarah to sleep soundly. Every night, Ellen heard her footsteps in the hall, the same soft shuffle as she checked to make sure he was still there. On Wednesday, he found her in the attic. The door cracked open, her small body curled up by a dusty window. She was staring outside, her fingers wrapped around Lionel, but her eyes were glazed with memory. "What are you doing up here, kiddo?" Alan asked softly. Her voice was flat, mechanical. "I used to sleep in places like this." Alan's stomach churned. "Not here." She turned to face him, her face pale in the thin light. "But what if they win?" Alan sat beside her, his back against the wall. "Then I'll appeal. And if they win again, I'll fight harder. And if they keep trying, I'll fight until I run out of breath." Sarah's lip trembled. "Why?" "Because you deserve someone who doesn't give up." For a long moment, she was silent. Then she shifted, resting her head tentatively against his arm. The first time she'd reached for him instead of pulling away. The day of the hearing arrived heavy with tension. Rain clung to the windows, the sky a blanket of unbroken gray. Sarah wore the same navy dress, her curls combed carefully, her hands twisting Lionel's ear the entire drive to the courthouse. Inside, the Greenfields were already seated at their table, Randall's arms crossed, Sheila's smile painted on like cheap wallpaper. Their attorney, a thin man with a permanent frown, sat flipping through a stack of papers meant to paint Alan as a rogue judge abusing his power. Alan didn't care. Let them try. Sarah's hand found his as they stood before Judge Marianne Vickers, her expression as neutral as ever. "We are here for the expedited review of the Greenfield versus Whittaker matter," she said, her voice crisp. "Both parties have submitted their preliminary evidence. We will begin with the Greenfields." Their lawyer stood, presenting a glossy photo album filled with staged pictures. Sarah sitting stiffly at a birthday party table, her smile forced, her eyes dull. "The Greenfields provided a loving, structured home for Sarah," he said. "They followed all state guidelines." Helen watched Sarah's shoulders curl inward, her thumb rubbing Lionel's ear in frantic circles. "Judge Whittaker unlawfully removed her," the lawyer continued, "and used his personal feelings to override established placement policies." Alan stood. "The placement system failed Sarah," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "The Greenfield's spotless record doesn't erase Sarah's truth." He turned to Sarah. "Do you want to tell the court what happened?" Sarah's breath came in shallow bursts. I. "Take your time," Alan said softly. Sheila Greenfield stood abruptly. "She's a manipulative child. She makes things up for attention." Sarah flinched, curling toward Alan. "Sit down, Mrs. Greenfield," Judge Vickers said sharply. Sheila sank back into her chair, her face mottled red. Alan knelt beside Sarah. "Remember what I told you. The truth matters." Sarah's fingers dug into Lionel, but she lifted her head. Her voice was barely louder than a whisper. "They locked me in the basement." The words hung heavy in the air. "They said I was too noisy, that nobody wanted me." Randall's jaw twitched. "Lies." "Quiet," Judge Vickers snapped. Sarah's voice shook, but she kept going. "They took my food away if I spilled anything. They said I was lucky they let me stay at all." Alan's chest felt like it might burst from holding in everything he wanted to say. But Sarah wasn't done. "I'm not lying," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'm not making it up." Judge Vickers folded her hands. "That's enough." The silence stretched as she reviewed her notes. Then, at last, her gavel fell. "Custody of Sarah Bennett will remain with Judge Alan Whittaker under temporary guardianship, pending final review." Sarah's hand crushed Alan's. The Greenfields lawyer leaped to his feet. "Your Honor, my ruling stands." Sarah's breath left her in a shuddering sigh. Alan knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he whispered. Sarah shook her head. "We did." That night, Sarah sat in her new room, her books carefully arranged on the shelf, Lionel seated proudly on her pillow. Alan stood in the doorway, watching as she traced her finger along the spines, each book a promise that this time she was staying. "Good night," Alan said softly. Sarah turned, her eyes shining. "Good night, Dad." The word was soft, uncertain, but it filled the room like sunlight after a storm. Alan's throat tightened. "Good night, sweetheart." The door closed softly, and for the first time in years, Alan Whittaker felt his house was truly home.